Good evening, Jason. Jason, for the second time this month, I get to sit down with you. But the one bit of good news is that you're now back on the West Coast, but I have transferred over to England. And this is in preparation for Performance Days in Munich, which is the European version of the Functional Fabric Fair. So to begin with, thank you, Jason. We've never had two fireside chats with anyone. Um, and I want to build on the first fireside chat because you gave so much in the way of education that I realize it's not just me or the industry, but the clarity of the lines of thought that you were starting to express. I just need to find out more. So with your permission, Jason, I'd like to go straight back in on as a continuation from our conversation in Portland. Does that sound
Right
good
in.
to you?
Yeah. And first of all, it's great to be here with you, Charles. And sorry that I'm not here with you in person in Munich. I would have loved to have been there, but we're all slowly ramping back up on this travel. So I'm doing a little bit more, but haven't done as much yet. So sorry I'm not there with you in Munich.
No problem. Jason, I want to take you back to we first met in Annecy when you were the first employee of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, but you're now you're the chief executive of Higg. So we first met a decade ago. Mm-hmm. Can you just summarize what's changed in the last decade? Because from my point of view, sustainability is no longer an add-on, it's become a core. But you've been at the middle of a far more than I have. So yes, over the last decade, how's everything changed from your point of view?
Oh, it's a great question. I think the biggest change, as you started to mention, is that this has become mandatory. And I think when I met you in Annecy, there were probably only, I don't know, 200 or 300 sustainability professionals in the whole clothing industry, and now there are literally thousands. It went from something that a few trailblazers had been doing, or something that a few larger companies that were focused on compliance and starting to spread into other subjects had been doing, and now it is starting to be something that is just core to doing business. If you're a large company, or if you're an outdoor brand who part of your reputation, identity is based on your impact to the environment, working on sustainability, working on impact is just what you have to do. And I think that's been a big change that we've seen over the last 10 years. I think another change that's happened is that these kind of tools for measurement have gone from something that was cool and nice to have to something that has become very normal and a part of doing business. We at Higg now work with 600 or 700 brands. The standards that were developed by the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the Higg Index, are now in the hands of 40 or 50,000 different users. And it's gone from something that was just a cool idea to something is a basic of doing business. I think what still hasn't changed back from when we met is that the road ahead of us is still very long, and there's still a lot of work to do. And while we've made a lot of progress and started getting companies on the same page for a common framework for measurement, common ways of thinking about their impact, I think what we haven't yet seen, other than really just a handful of companies, is starting to bring that impact down and actually invest enough on the ground and in changes in their companies to see the changes that we need to live in a, we might no longer be able to even say within a 1.5 degree world, but to even live in a 2 or 3 degree world is still a long way to go. And there's a ton of work to do. And I think what we've started is we built the foundation for the transformation, but the transformation is just getting started.
Okay. On the back of that, in the last 10 years, the differences I've noticed is that suddenly big companies are talking about compliance and governance coming in, environmental, social governance. And that has corresponded to me with the rise of Higg, the SAC's influence, and everyone using the Higg Index tool. But we've also had a much greater degree of professionalism coming in. When we met you a decade ago, it was Jason is obviously a keen person who can do things, but no one's actually got a qualification in this. Now, I know that I teach the most Mickey Mouse subject at university. So when we started the subject, no one had a further degree in it. So on the subject of both compliance and professionalism, can you make comments about how that has also changed over the last decade?
Oh, absolutely. I think when we started working on this 10 years ago, it was mostly people that either were coming from within the business and were really passionate about sustainability, who had ideas about how to change the way that their businesses operate, that were sitting in the seats. Or you also had a handful of people that knew a fair amount about general environmental or social topics, but didn't really know much about the business coming in. And I think what we're starting to see are more people that are bringing these things together, people that came out of the business and have gone back to get a graduate degree in sustainability, or that have that education in sustainability and know the business. And that combination of both understanding kind of the larger changes that need to happen in the world, plus what are the levers to actually change impact within a company, that's starting to come together in a way that's just so much more professional than we ever saw before. I think there still is a gap. There still is a gap between what students need to learn coming out of these programs and how they actually apply that to the real world. Bringing them both together entirely from a graduate program is still coming together, but I do think this marriage of either business experience and sustainability knowledge is really showing a different degree of professionalism in the field, and people are really good at their jobs. They know how to make change. They know where to look. They also don't have to start from ground zero. I think one of the benefits of the Higg Index is it's given this framework at a brand level or at a product level or at a factory level to know where to start. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel and start asking questions about what's material. It's already done for you. And so that's really allowed sort of those professionals to go even faster and started to make the change. But that being said, there's still a long way to go. And I think the next generation of people, if I were to add a new skill that's really important, not just knowing the business and knowing sustainability topics, it's also about change management. And now that we know what to do, it's really about how do you actually make that change on the ground? How do you persuade people from leadership to those that have been doing the same job for 20 years to change the way that they're thinking about things to lower a company or a product or a materials impact?
And on the back of that, when we chatted at the start of this month, we talked about the vast array of different sustainability audits. Here in Europe, we've got over 1,000 of them. Can you just try and highlight to us? There are 1,000 of them. I can name about 100 of them. But can you highlight, for the sake of our audience, what differentiates Higg? Because you are the technology platform provider. So you're the joining part between the ideas at the SAC and what the Higg tool actually implements. So can you almost highlight what differentiates the Higg Index from anything else out there, please?
Sure. No, that's a great question. And first, just to reiterate, the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the trade association, the multi-stakeholder initiative, they are the ones who design the standards, the questions, the weightings, things like that actually go into the Higg tools. And as you said, Charles, we're responsible at Higg, the company, with supporting putting that on a technology platform and supporting users and getting through it so that they can use this. I think the biggest differentiator is that there are many, many different standards and tools that look at some very important part of the value chain, like it might be chemicals and materials, or it might be different social standards at a factory, or it might be carbon at the company level. And what the Higg Index does as a tool set is it really looks across the value chain and gives that holistic view of how does everyone who touches a product in some way, whether they're a product designer, product developer, a manufacturer, a facility manager at a facility, whether it's a brand manager that's actually shaping how a company works, or a retailer that's figuring out how to sell something and how do you buy more sustainable products. Every single one of those people has a role in shaping how to make more sustainable products. And what Higg does is it gives all of those decision makers up and down the value chain a way to try to shape the sustainability of products in the area that they can control. And I think that's what's different is that instead of taking sort of one small part of the value chain and focusing on that, this is really holistic. And I think what's unique about Higg is the way that it brings together so many different impact areas, so many different decision makers, and really the whole breadth of the value chain kind of work together to reduce impact. And that's what I think is most different. The other thing that I think is really different and important to note is that I would say for a long time, that the focus has been on standard, pass, fail. Did you do X, Y, and Z, and therefore are you okay? And I think that is it's a great place to start, and it's been great in eliminating some really important challenges that needed to be changed. Like it's great for removing chemicals that have no business being on our products or touching our bodies or ending up in our waterways. Or it's been great in getting some of the worst abuses out of the factory social impact, for worker safety or for basic health of workers. Those kind of standards that are pass-fail have been great for doing that. They do address some of these core problems, and we know that they're solved in a way. But when you look holistically, I think what we see is that we have a value chain that's going to need to keep changing and getting better and better and changing and higher performance every year. And that is one of the other big differentiators of Higg. It's a scaled framework that allows you to understand where are you now and where can you be tomorrow. And it's not a perfect sort of binary decision about what's better, because sometimes you also have to understand what are the trade-offs. But what Higg does do for its users is it gives this framework for improvement. And we see this in the data. The factories that use Higg, they get better every year when they use it year over year and over 3 or 4 years. Same thing with the brands. And so I think that is also a big differentiator is it's this continuous improvement mechanism, and it's not something that you're ever going to be done with. The other part about it is it's a growing and adapting set of tools. So as new issues become more clear to society and there's a science behind them, there's a way to measure them, they get introduced into this framework so that we also recognize, like, we're never done with sustainability. We have to keep working on it kind of forever. And that as our needs and as our understanding of issues change, we just have to start working on those new issues too. But it also means we don't forget like the other things that are really important. Just because microfibers or microplastics emerges on the scene doesn't mean we can just suddenly forget about carbon or forget about chemical impacts. It means that that's a new thing that we have to actually bring into our thinking and evolve our thinking as we go forward.
One of the things that you have been able to educate or almost reinforce to my mind is that perfection is almost impossible, because the target is always moving where we're going to. And Higg has enabled us to move away from bad, like so many of the other audits, but actually now to make a more informed choice. So we're no longer reducing the amount of bad we're doing, but we can actually make it an educated standpoint to do better, which is a very interesting thing, because when we describe the journey of sustainability, the only thing I can guarantee is that if I predict even 10 years' time, I know by the time we're there, the target's actually moved on. So you must enhance a lot of goodwill to get people in motion when we don't actually know the target. And as an aside, I'd just like to bring in one of the first guys who talked to me seriously about Higg and where it fitted to everything else was Kevin from REI. And Kevin was one of the early guys who was coming out of the third party saying, at REI, we're getting aboard with this. We don't know precisely what it is, but it's the best thing we've seen going. And we've now seen REI not only develop phenomenal policies, but also Kevin himself has now moved to Blue Sign. And I take it as an act of endorsement. The guy who believes so much in Higg works for another standard, but he still sees how they all fit together and they work alongside each other. So to me, that's more reflection that so much work that has been done with the Fairwear Foundation, with Blue Sign, is not wasted. You're just encompassing it all from a more strategic direction. Now, on the back of that, when this project started, there was the feed in from the knowledge at Patagonia. There was the clout from Walmart joining in. There was, with permission, working with the Night Green tool, their sustainability information, and also the European Outdoor Group Eco Index. But the thing which has fascinated me about the project is that how can you make a project appeal to both big and small companies? Because when you started, you were definitely working with the big and you got phenomenal traction and momentum going. And now I see more of a development for smaller brands. Can I ask you to reflect? I've already pointed out that the standard, it's near impossible to do it perfectly, but how are you able to balance it between the demands of the big brands and the international players, but also the small brands?
Yeah, great questions. A lot in there. Maybe I'll just, there are a few themes that just to touch on. I mean, one, you started with asking about just kind of like, how do you make sure that it continuously improves and you don't sort of let perfection be the enemy of good enough. And we agree that was one of the early founding principles of the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. I think, though, it's really important that while continuous improvement and getting better is important, that also is not enough, and that you have to have kind of a floor. I think you need a floor that raises and a ceiling that raises as well. There are some of the tools like the facility environmental assessment or environmental module that does have a floor as well. And so you can't actually get credit for continuously improving in energy management if you're not following your basic permits for wastewater or for air quality or other thing like that. So I do think there is a floor where everyone agrees is that this is kind of the minimum that is acceptable for basic performance, even if you're doing a lot of great things at the top level. You can't ignore the basics also. And so that is built into some of the thinking behind the assessments as well, is that there is a bottom, even though and that bottom has to go up, even though you want to make sure that you don't exclude others. And I think that's where we have tried to, or the Sustainable Apparel Coalition in designing this has tried to shape the tools themselves, is that they have to work for a top performer and they have to work for someone who's just getting started as well. And the scaled nature is something that really is important for the design, so that anyone can use this as an entry point. And we're seeing this now with our users at Higg, the company. We're seeing way more SMEs jump on the platform than we are seeing new big brands and big retailers. Part of that, I think, is that a lot are already on board on the big side. I think also a lot of smaller companies are looking for a place to get started. And the tool really does allow you to get started really anywhere. But when it comes to getting credit, you might not get credit if you're not doing even the basic things. You also talked, Charles, about sort of working with others and how important that is. I totally agree. At Higg Co, we're exploring about 40 different partnership opportunities right now, and we see sharing of data as something that can really support lots of different initiatives and make it easier to get more, say, materials into the bluesign system, for example, just as an idea of what could be possible using Higg data. We see lots of other opportunities too, and I think that is important. Higg doesn't make bluesign or ZDHC go away. Ideally, what we can do is use that data to make even more facilities recognize how important it is to manage their input chemistry, or reduce, make sure that they have really clean chemistry on the products that they're using. And I guess finally, just to say that it is just really important that any framework, if it's going to succeed, it really does have to get away from the binary standards conversation. I always used to tell my team that the challenge with standards is they're either phenomenal and nobody uses them, or they're mediocre and they're very popular. And I think that's what Higg has tried. The Higg Index has tried to do, is sort of bridge that space in between, where it can be relevant for those that are trying to really push the bounds on environmental impact, and it still can be usable to anybody who's, even if they're just getting started. I think where that shows up probably the most is in the way the scores come together. Nobody gets an 100, and that's okay. The average scores on the facility or brand assessments, they're 40s, 50s. They're really kind of mid-level, and I think that's a reflection of where the value chain really is. We need full transformation of factories, of companies, to get to a place that, like, we could even start saying is sustainable, because we're not there yet. And also, I think it's a recognition that even the companies that are recognized as leaders always have areas where they can improve, and that even the leaders don't do great in every section. We've heard this from some of the leaders. They've said that, you know, by looking at the brand assessment, they saw that they weren't doing enough in transportation. They hadn't figured out how to almost eliminate air freight, which is just a huge contributor to carbon emissions at the brand level. Or they didn't understand that others were doing much better than they were on packaging. And when they saw the kind of benchmarking, they could understand that even the leaders, even these leaders that are pretty far ahead in many, many different areas, still had areas to improve on. And we see that across the board, that nobody does perfect. Everyone has room to grow. And that's the intention of this framework, is that everyone should use it to get better every year. And I think when you see more and more companies that are starting to get in the 80s, 90s, 100, that's not time to, sit back and say, great, we're done. That's time to introduce new issues and to introduce new goals for lowering impact, so that those 60s, 70s, 80s become 50s, 60s again. And I think that's just the role of a scaled assessment that needs to keep evolving as impact changes.
On the subject of that, I know the tool is based very much on LCA information, which is actually nothing to do with you. It's where brands have carried out LCAs, and that forms the basis of so many of the scales and the decisions which the SAC will then transfer through to the tool, which you guys facilitate. Now, working off the theory that every LCA is on past performance, because the moment it's published, it's technically out of date. The bit that I'm interested in is, we know the three biggest fabrics in the world are polyester, cotton, and polycotton. Now, we could divert the conversation and talk about a really rare material like silk. I don't want to do that. We're here to sort out the big part of business. So from the pool of LCAs, can you give me an idea of how many, for instance, polyester LCAs you guys will be continually juggling with, or when a new batch of LCAs come in, how much of a change until you recalibrate the scale that you've got? Please.
Oh, great question. So First, just for clarity, there are many tools in the Higg index tool set, and really only the materials in MSI, Material Sustainability Index, and our product tools really touch on LCA. The other tools, the facility tools, environment or social, or the brand tools, those also are asking lots of different things. They do include performance indicators on carbon emissions, and so we look at impacts in all of the other tools. But life cycle assessment per se, science and thinking, is really focused just towards one part of the tool set. And that's where there's been the most criticism, questioning about that. Some of that is because of LCA methodology itself, where I think there's a lot of concern that LCA impacts don't fully describe the impacts of a product. That's true. That we recognize, and I think there are some interesting efforts to add new impact areas to LCAs. Like there's an effort to actually add quantifiable microfibers releases to LCA impacts as well as a new impact category. And then there are also some criticisms of it because some individuals, companies, materials makers don't like the results. They don't like the way that their fabrics show up in LCAs, partially because it may actually be a contrast to the brand image that they've been cultivating for that product or that fiber, and that is what it is. And then finally, LCAs also reveal sometimes unforeseen impacts where we don't necessarily think as much about, say, the synthetic inputs that go into a natural fiber from fertilizers or for pesticides. And sometimes those kind of bring them out into our attention when it's not something that we have thought about. We recognize those are inherent challenges with having any kind of LCA methodology. And I think we accept that because right now, one, that's where legislation is going. The product environmental footprint legislation in Europe is really LCA based. And the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, Higg Co, and others have been working for many years with the Commission on how do we implement a product environmental footprinting compatible methodology. And so that has, getting ready for that regulation, working closely with the Commission, has been important for us for many years, and also for the Sustainable Apparel Coalition for many years. All of that being said, we're going to get the LCAs will get this wrong. We will get it wrong. Folks will get the impacts wrong. And that's why the materials have to be updated and the LCA information behind them have to be updated all the time. So we add, I think it's something like, I could be wrong on this, but I believe it's about 50 material modifications per quarter. And so anytime, and that's across not just the ones that you just mentioned, but much more broadly. So we add new materials or new data behind the materials, and that will change the whole model. I think it's also important to note that any kind of model is an imperfect version of reality. It's by nature, it's a model. It's going to be imperfect. So it's not to say that you want to overstate the specificity of a product and its impacts, but you want to start to understand it. And I think finally, I would add that the way that these tools, I'd say, have been most misunderstood is that it's like a battle of the materials, and that's never how it was really intended to be used. I think the way that it's intended to be used is so that a designer or a developer can understand the relative impacts. There's some value judgments to be made on these relative impacts, like who's to say that water is more important than carbon or vice versa. That's something that a designer or the company behind it has to understand. What are its priorities? Is it trying to reduce carbon? And finally, I think if you think about the way that a designer chooses their materials, they tend to first look at, like, what are they trying to make? And then they may use a tool like the MSI or the product tool to see how do they reduce impact. but it tends not to be, I was going to make a cotton product and now I'm going to make a polyester product. It tends to be more of they already were speccing out a cotton product or a polyester product, and then they might choose, should I use recycled polyester? How much does that lower the CO2 impact? Or should I use organic cotton? How much does that lower the CO2 impact? Those are important things to weigh for a designer as they're trying to look at the overall ways to reduce impact. There are lots of other ways they can do that too, such as changing the facilities where some of those materials are bought or shaped and processed, dyed, finished. All of those things can also go into it. And so I think that's also why LCA should not necessarily just be used on its own. It's just one component to look more broadly across a whole set of decisions to be made that shape the overall sustainability of a product.
That makes a lot of sense to me. And I could potentially be about to apologize here for being fascinated in purely the materials and ignoring the facility modules, the brand and retail module. But this is performance days, so we are very much focused on the fibers themselves. I'm not going to go into the first generation of Higg, which was self-reflective. So rather than drawing hard and fast lines, you implemented a line of thought, which is, as long as you're achieving better each time you're doing the audit, you're going in the right direction. That is a philosophy which is carried on, and all your action seems to be based around that. But I do want to go back to our conversation in Portland. And right now, the conversation is on the Functional Fabric Fair website. If you go to the Portland show in the Education on Demand tab, you were very candid. You faced every question that came from the floor, no matter what I tried to ask as well. The impression we all walked away with was that whether Higg and everything associated, so the Higg Index, the MSI, the various modules, and the SAC, whether or not it had won our approval, it was the most seriously considered philosophy in this area. So full respect to you guys. You have thought through every channel, and you were able to come up with an answer that inspired us to actually work towards it. But I want to ask you now, you came to Portland, you met the outdoor trade, the outdoor and sports trade. What is your reflection from being at the event? But also, I want to slip in a part two question, which is, a decade ago, the outdoor and sports trade thought we were leading the whole of the sustainability conversation. Are we still there? So,
great question. So, I guess one thing I love walking the shows, and it was great to actually see the booths and see the samples and talk to some of the folks that are there. I think one thing that I really was taken by was how much sustainability has entered the lexicon of every fabric producer that was showing at performance days, and I don't think that is ever probably going to go back. It's really a huge difference from where we are 10 years ago, where you might have seen either nothing, really vague claims about, like, you might have even seen the words like eco-friendly, which now is is clearly a bad word because it doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't actually tie to any reductions. And if you talk to the salespeople 10 years ago, they wouldn't have been able to tell you anything about the sustainability attributes. It might have been like there was, one person that worked for a fabric company that could tell the salespeople a few things to say, but the salespeople themselves typically weren't knowledgeable about it. That has all changed, and that's a substantial difference than where we were 10 years ago. That being said, I think there's still some fundamental challenges that are uncomfortable, like PFAs are still kind of an awkward conversation. The performance attributes from that chemistry are really desirable by a lot of the companies who are really uncomfortable with the idea of maybe giving those up. And that also is a subject that hasn't fully changed. And I think now we're starting to see regulations that may force some of the forever chemicals to exit the market. On your question of, but that being said, I'd say overall huge progress. It's impressive to see this shift so that this has become normal and a part of doing business, which is what we hoped would happen, where companies would actually sell more sustainable fibers and sell fewer less sustainable fibers. That's a hope, and that's starting to come true. When it comes to whether or not outdoor is still leading, I think it's different. I think what we are seeing now is that a lot of the larger companies have invested sizable resources into sustainability, and sometimes have huge teams working on this, or making everything from innovation investments to transformation of their supply chains. And I think with most of outdoor that are, especially a lot of companies that are smaller, which is kind of often the core of the outdoor community, or these slightly smaller brands that have dedicated staff. Often the founders are still really close to the work. I'd say those groups have still done some great things, but I would say I've seen maybe less leadership as in times past. I'm a little disappointed to see things, and I talked about this in Portland, to see carbon offsets replacing essentially sincere efforts to reduce impacts. And offsets have their place. They can be great for things like protecting nature and making investments in landscapes that otherwise may not have enough value to stay intact as a natural ecosystem. But they're not very good if they come as a way to delay or prevent making changes in a value chain today that should be made today, or should have been made yesterday. And I've been a little bit disappointed to see offsets supplanting impact. And I think we also are just seeing the rest of the industry catch up and overinvest compared to outdoor in sustainability. That being said, I think the heart and soul of the outdoor industry is still really committed to the subject. That's not going away. I'm sure we'll see some interesting innovations come out of the outdoor industry in the future, but it's no longer alone. It's no longer kind of by itself as the vanguard.
I've been fortunate in that several of these Fireside chats have been with people who I'm sure are lobbying within the SAC. Nick from Patagonia, Julian from the North Face, Christiana, who was at Fjallraven, and Eva at Hagloss, not Hagloss Houdini, she'll kill me for referring to her as Hagloss. And they have all re-strengthened their commitment to do better practice. Now, one of my big reflections from Portland, because you gave us a wealth of details, things like the growth within the people using the Higg tool is 10 times bigger within the smaller companies than the bigger companies, how the MSI can actually be accessed free of charge so that people can start to make a balanced decision. But the one thing you said, which threw me, which I've now had a couple of weeks to reflect on, and I've gone, genius statement, which is the whole of the industry has tied itself up fixating too much on the words that we use and arguing about what the right semantics are, as opposed to getting on and doing good practice. Could I ask you just to restate what you said about words, because you threw a whole array of them and you threw an overall direction that made a lot more sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at the history of the words, it's really a reflection in some ways of how much time we have left to make a difference. And one of my environmental mentors, a guy named Huey Johnson, He was in the room when Gro Harlem Brundtland sort of coined the sustainability term, where we were providing for the needs of this generation without compromising the needs of the next. And that was, in some ways, kind of, I think we could say now that was quaint, considering how much work we need to do and how maybe, and I think that was in early 70s, that was actually coined. And when we look at where we are now, we have not been doing that. We haven't been living up to that. And so there's been a lot of pressure on changing the word. And I think this is starting to accelerate even faster. And so we've seen within the last few years a lot of interest in circularity, where we instead of just thinking about this intergenerational equity, we're starting to think about, like, okay, the products and the things that we're using today, can we reuse them? Can we do this without essentially damaging the ecosystem or taking more out than we need to? And that is also now I'm starting to see sort of circularity being supplanted by regeneration, where I think we recognize that not only can we not take more out of the system today than we put back in, but we actually need to be even going further. We need to be sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. We need to be expanding healthy ecosystems rather than just maintaining them. And I think that's a reflection of sort of how far along we are in terms of impact. I think since we spoke, the IPCC most recent report came out, really saying that, like, we're at seconds to midnight in our ability to make a change, and so we need to go even further. I would not be surprised if regeneration in the next few years is replaced by some other phrase. All of this is being said, though, is I think that there's a real question of, like, do the words really matter? I think there's really a question of, are we actually reducing our impact? Is our CO2 emissions less than it was last year? Are we creating new solutions where we're sucking more out of the atmosphere, with things that we're actually driving within our companies or within our control? So I think we need to move on, instead of arguing about whether regenerative is better than circular, which is better than sustainable, and we're all annoyed with the word sustainable because it doesn't do X, Y, or Z. I think we need to get over it and just really get to a point where we're either reducing impact, showing how we're reducing impact, or we're not. And if we're not, you shouldn't be in business. You shouldn't be in the market. You should actually be demonstrating how you're getting better and how your products are actually part of a solution. So I hope we move beyond the words. And I don't know, Charles, you've probably been to hundreds of conferences where someone raises their hand and says, the problem is that the word sustainable is just not working for me. It's like, the problem is that we're not actually reducing our impact. The problem is that we're not getting better. Let's forget about the words and let's actually go on to real demonstration of improvement.
I have actually been at conference where someone has told me that regenerative agriculture has a problem with the phraseology of the word, nothing to do with what it was, and this was why it would never take off. But that was what we discussed at the beginning of the month. I want to talk about the future. And there are two major things which have happened this year. One from your side, which is you getting closer to the American Impact Institute. But
Apparel
also,
impact.
yes, sir. But also from over here in Europe, where we've had the EU Green Deal legislation be produced, which looks into eco-design, due diligence, and green claims. Now, this is one of those massive questions. What should we be paying attention to? And without trying to rush your conclusion, how do I know that I can trust Higg to give me the solution? Because trying to keep up with all these new developments is still a major occupation. So I need to refer to people who know more than me. And as an academic, I'm quite simple. I have a medium-sized brain. And when I find people who know more than me, I like to trust them. Why should I be trusting Higg to provide the tooling which is going to help me through their work that you're doing with the AII and also the EU Green Deal?
No, great question. So I would say first, we're really shifting ourselves from just being a host of the Higg Index to being more of a platform. And I think what we also recognize is that measurement is absolutely a core part of the solution to reducing impact. It is not the only sort of tool. It's like I mean, we've been criticized, I think, fairly for saying that we're serving as the scale. But if you want to make improvement, you need to also have a diet, and you can't just think of measurement as the only solution, because if you're going to lose weight, you absolutely need a scale, and all routes are going to say that you're going to get on your scale every day. But you also need to do the work, and you need to figure out how do you create improvement every day. That's your diet, or that's your exercise plan, or that's the way that you're changing the way that you eat. And similarly, I think we're also trying to say, how do we support those efforts to create change on the ground? So we've been working with the Apparel Impact Institute to host their carbon leadership program on our platform, which really is about how does an individual factory not only measure itself using Higg, but work with qualified engineers to figure out its action plan for reducing carbon over a 1, 2, 3 year period to significantly reduce the impacts of that factory itself. So we believe in this program. We've seen it's had great results, and we wanted to share that with a wider audience by putting it on our platform, and we want to support its expansion. And I think what Apparel Impact Institute is doing is really saying, okay, if we're going to transform essentially the landscape of factory impact, we're going to need to invest. And this isn't just about like patting ourselves on the back and saying we're using a preferred material or we bought some renewable energy. No, we actually need to go in and change the way that our boilers are operating and change the fuel source of these things that boil hot water away from coal and towards electricity or other much lower or zero carbon solutions. So one is we want to go ahead and support those other efforts that are actually helping to create that on the ground transformation. And that's part of what we're trying to support. I think another thing that we're also trying to support is, you mentioned the new policy changes directed at the textile industry in Europe, due diligence, green claims, and product eco-design principles. These are all critical, and these are something that we're going to, some of these we've been working on for years. The Higg Index brand and retail module was one of the first tools that went through the alignment process with the OECD as a due diligence tool. But we're also looking at other tools that are maybe more appropriate for an SME for due diligence. How do you comply with these emerging laws? The green claims legislation, a lot of that is going to likely tie to product environmental footprinting, something that we've been working with, we in the Sustainable Apparel Coalition have been working with the Commission for many, many years on. And as well, eco-design principles, it's something that I think we've already tried to build into the product module. SAC has done a great job doing that with a methodology. We're trying to do that, look at that even further. How can we support these laws? So I look at both sort of the voluntary actions that are happening, the measurement efforts, the legislation that's happening, and I think all of it is exciting, important, and we need to support it, and we need to go even further with it. So the last thing I would ever want to do is say there's only one solution or one silver bullet to create impact. We want to support everything from measurement to investment to compliance with new laws and to getting ready to comply with those new laws. These are all things that we have to do as a company, and we're going to be investing a lot in over the next 1 to 2 years.
Sound. Thank you for that. Now, I want to wind down because they've only given us a slot. We can't take over the whole of the show. A couple of questions to wind down. The first one is more about Jason. If you had the opportunity to bump into Jason a decade ago, what advice do you wish he had been told? So in other words, what skills and learnings do you wish you had better abilities in before you started this job? And also, what has surprised you about being at the middle of it all, as in skills that you didn't think that you thought you would have to use, but haven't been in such great demand?
Oh, it's a great question. I think knowledge, data, and benchmarking and know-how are all really important, but they're only important when paired with persuasion. And we all, if we're working throughout this value chain trying to create change, I think the most important thing is really convincing others to go along with you in this journey to create change within a company or within the value chain, and persuade others to work with you. And I think one of the things we started this conversation with was talking about this combination of business knowledge and sustainability knowledge is coming together and creating professionalism. And now this last chapter is really about change management, because we now know what to do, we know what we should do, and now we actually have to roll up our sleeves and do it and convince everyone to come along with us. And I think that's going to be the most important skill going into this as we move forward. It's not just about the knowledge anymore. It's really about how do you get others to change. And I see that. We saw that with some of the people that showed up in Portland. They're really committed young designers that have come out of design schools or textile schools with a lot of passion for making change, and a lot of now know-how from taking classes from people like you, Charles. And how they move to the next level is really how do they convince others when they show up in their new job, really excited about these changes that they can make. How do they convince others to actually do it and move the needle? So I think that is really important. And I think if I were giving some advice to my past self, I would probably say both be patient, but don't allow it to go as slow as it probably will happen. And I wish I had both been appreciative of how long change takes to happen and been a little patient, but also never let off, because however fast it's starting to happen, it's not fast enough given the state of the world. And I think it was Sally Urin from Forum for the Future who said that change takes time, but when it happens very quickly. And I think we're now finally starting to see, after years and years of it really kind of just slowly moving along, that we've reached a tipping point, and now everyone is recognizing we need to change fast. And so we've got legislation coming, we've got consumer pressure coming, we've got now imperatives from leadership that are here. And so it's now happening fast, and we have to keep it going fast so that we can actually survive in a planet that is thriving and doing right by its inhabitants.
Well, on that very subject, I now want to give you a 30-second opportunity to plug what you do, because I've made you work for the last hour. If people are interested, what should they do next? How do they interact with Higg?
Well, I would just say take a look at our work on higg.com, and we would love to share more with you. If you're just starting to get started, many of the tools you can look at without necessarily even paying anything, but some of the things do require you to actually dig in to engage with your value chain or your company. And we'd love to support you on your journey. So please do reach out to us, but check out our website at www.higg.com.
And on the back of that, you've also got a new person joining you to head up Europe. So that will hopefully enable a cleaner line of communication with all the brands based over here.
We're not just a new person. We're actually looking at a significant increase in our investment and shifting in Europe, and we're even looking at building some European entities as well. I think we really are deeply committed to serving wherever Europe is going to go with its policy ambitions. And so we're going to be investing a lot in Europe over the coming years.
Well, that's brilliant. And at this stage, we normally get to ask you questions. I go out into the audience. But can I flip this and actually say, Jason, what questions do we need to take away from this session that we need to ask within our own companies? So what questions do you think best will enable this change to have a start? Everyone's talking about it, but as you've emphasized up to now, doing it is more important. So as you can tell, Jason, we've not rehearsed this interview. So chucked in at the end a question, but this time you get to ask it of us all. What question should we be asking of our own companies?
I think at a top level, I think every company should be asking itself, how can I fundamentally transform this company within the next 3 years? And how can I actually change the way that our products are designed, the way that our products are developed, the way that they're used, what happens to them to the end of their life? And how do we use changes to those products and every decision that goes into them to lower carbon impacts, to improve the useful life of that product, and to do something with it when it's done. And so I think everyone should be asking, not just how do I get better, but how do I fundamentally transform within 3 years with a real time bound?
That's a brilliant way to end the interview, because I'm just there thinking about what to do next. So, Jason, on behalf of everyone at Performance Days, can I just say thank you for being so candid and, fielding everything that I can throw at you. But more importantly, thank you for believing that there is a way to do it and hacking with all of us who need to catch up and keeping on pushing. So yes, on behalf of Performance Days and the Functional Fabric Fair, thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Charles.